So, hello again, everyone. I'm going to discuss now the last part of our lesson for this week. And in this last part, we're going to talk about the different mechanisms of hormone action. So, at the end of this lectures, we're going to talk about our fifth objective, which is to explain the mechanisms of hormone action. So, the different hormones are classified into different major types. You have your amine hormones or your amino acid derivatives. So majority of this is from your amino acid tyrosine. So that's your dopamine, catecholamines, and your thyroid hormones. Next, you have your polypeptide. Peptide hormone could be small neuropeptides or large proteins. So your small peptides are your GnRH, TRH, somatostatin, and your vasopressin. And your large proteins now are your insulin, your LH, and your parathyroid hormone. Next, you have your steroid hormones. No? The steroid hormones are mostly cholesterol derivatives, no? And majority this will include or adrenocortical hormones such as your cortisol and your estrogen as well, and your testosterone. No, these are all from your cholesterol. And last, vitamin derivatives. Your vitamin derivatives, so your vitamins are not just vitamins, but they can also act as hormones. So that's your vitamin A and your vitamin D. So when we go to calcium and mineral metabolism, I'll talk to you about the crucial role of vitamin D in bone and mineral metabolism. So in terms of synthesis of hormones, your polypeptide and your protein hormones are initially stored in secretory vesicles until they are needed. And usually they are synthesized as large proteins that are not biologically active yet. No? Here, after your DNA is described and eventually translated to proteins, they are initially produced as pre-prohormones. Then they undergo processing in your endoplasmic reticulum, and some of the portions of your pre-prohormones are cleaved, making them smaller prohormones, no, in the endoplasmic reticulum. And then they are now packaged into secretory vesicles in your Golgi apparatus. And upon stimulus, usually by calcium and intracellular increase in cyclin AMP, results in their release via exocytosis. The vesicles are excluded out of your cell, your glandular cells, and the walls, the packaging of the vesicles merges with the wall of your cell, releasing your peptide hormones into the circulation. And usually, your polypeptide and protein hormones are water-soluble hormones. No? So that's how your polypeptide and protein hormones are synthesized and released from your glandular cells. Next is your steroid hormones. So your steroid hormones are usually synthesized from cholesterol and are not stored in the body in large amounts. And these are lipid-soluble hormones as opposed to your polypeptide and protein hormones with water-soluble. And they don't need, since they're lipid-soluble, can simply diffuse into your bilipid cellular membrane as opposed to your water-soluble hormones, which needs to be packaged first into vesicles. No? So your cholesterol esters in your cytoplasm vacuoles can be rapidly mobilized for steroid synthesis after a stimulus. If it's the adrenal gland, it's the ACTH that stimulates the activation of the pathway leading to synthesis of your adrenocortical hormones from your cholesterol. So these are examples of your steroid hormones, your cortisol from your zona fasciculata, am I right? RAFGM. Okay, zona, yeah, from the zona fasciculata, that's your cortisol, and then from your zona reticular, from your zona glomerularis is your aldosterone, no? And then lastly, your gonadal hormones, your testosterone and your estradiol, they are all steroid hormones and are all derived from their parent molecule, which is your cholesterol. Or not really parent molecule, but they're from precursor molecule, which is your cholesterol. Okay? So again, these are your steroid hormones, cholesterol, aldosterone, testosterone, estradiol. There are many other steroid hormones, and these are just some of the examples. Next are your amine hormones. So your amine hormones are amino acid derivatives, and the amino acid that they're derived from is your tyrosine. So your tyrosine is converted eventually to your thyroid hormone synthesis into your thyroid hormones, thyroxine and triiodothyronine, which is your T4 and T3. And your T4 and T3 are incorporated into the protein thyroglobulin, which is then stored in large follicles within your thyroid gland. So your thyroid hormones can be stored in your thyroid gland and can be released depending on the stimulation of your thyroid gland. Another example of your amine hormones are your adrenal medullary hormones. So earlier I talked to you about the thyroid hormones from the adrenocortical layer of the adrenal gland, no? From the adrenal cortex. This time in the adrenal medulla layer of your adrenal gland, you also have hormones being produced there, and these are your catecholamines, no? Your epinephrine and your norepinephrine. And they are taken up into vesicles and stored until they are secreted depending on the stimulus in the thyroid gland. And yeah. So earlier in the previous session, in part 2, I talked to you about negative feedback mechanism. And feedback control is important in order to control, no, the level of hormone secretion so that there will be no overactivity of hormone systems, no? So that your hormone system will not produce excessive hormones that can result in different endocrine disorders, no? Or endocrine hyperfunctioning disorders, no? So negative feedback prevents overactivity of hormone systems, no? So these are conditions or products resulting from the action of the hormone that tend to suppress further release. So for example, as I mentioned in the previous section, if let's say your thyroid gland is producing too much thyroid hormone T4 and T3, it will send a negative feedback to your pituitary. It will send a negative feedback signal into your pituitary so that your pituitary will now lower or decrease secretion of your thyroid stimulating hormone or your TSH, preventing further stimulation of your thyroid gland in order to bring back the thyroid hormone levels back to normal levels or back to homeostatic levels. Okay? So aside from negative feedback mechanisms, there are also certain instances where there will be positive feedback mechanisms. No? These are certain surges of hormones that occurs after continuous positive feedback. And one classic example would be your LH surge, no? Which stimulates the ovulation in your ovaries, no? So this happens when your GnRH, no, stimulates your anterior pituitary to produce luteinizing hormone, and this will result in the stimulation of your granulosa cell or your theca cells. If it stimulates your theca cells, it produces androgens, and your androgens are now aromatized, no, in your granulosa cells, and your granulosa cells will now secrete. Your aromatization will result in the production of your estrogen, and your estrogen will now provide positive feedback into your anterior pituitary. So instead of suppressing LH, it will increase the levels of LH. So your estrogen will stimulate your anterior pituitary to produce more LH. And the increase in LH will now produce more estrogen, and then provide again another positive feedback until the patient or the ovaries will experience an LH surge, resulting in the ovulation or the release of your ovum from the ovaries. Another feedback control of hormone secretion will be your periodic cyclical variation. So this can be influenced by seasonal changes, no, winter or summer or autumn, no. So aside from that, various stages of development, such as whether you are in the neonatal period, infancy, or childhood, or your teenage or your pubertal years, or adulthood and into aging, no, it can affect your levels of hormone secretions. Even the urinal pattern can also affect feedback control. So I'll discuss it in a couple of slides, no. For example, your growth hormone is increased during early period of sleep, no, and the increase in growth hormone now will, in kids, especially in kids, will now stimulate growth and development in children. That's why patients who are children who are sleep deprived can have some sort of growth stunting as well, because the growth hormone secretion is not maximized because of the sleep predation. So there's also such a thing as hormone cross-reactivity. So what does this mean? It's a crosstalk between different hormones. So for example, no, in pregnancy, you will have very high levels of beta HCG, or your human chorionic gonadotropin, or your beta HCG. And your beta HCG has similar beta subunit and beta subunits, no, and can act like your TSH, and can act on your TSH receptor. And when it acts on your TSH receptor, much like your TSH, it will now stimulate your T4 and T3 production from your thyroid gland. And because of the increase in your T3 and T4, the increase in T4 and T3 will now send a negative feedback to your pituitary to suppress TSH. And this is all because of the action of HCG or thyroid gland, or your TSH receptor activation, not during pregnancy. Okay. Next, it'll be another example of hormone cross-reactivity. Is there are certain tumors that secrete your insulin, like growth factor 2 or your IGF-2, and very high levels of IGF-2 from these pathologic tumors can cause hypoglycemia interacting with insulin and IGF-1 receptors, no, acting like insulin. Okay. Now, another example of hormone cross-reactivity is between your parathyroid hormone and your parathyroid hormone-related peptide, or your PTHRP, because we have one PTH receptor. Normally, this doesn't produce anything pathologic, except, no, when there are tumors, pathologic tumors that produce excessive PTHRP, causing excessive stimulation of your PTH receptor, causing hypercalcemia of malignancy. So in overall, the functions of hormones can be divided into three general areas: your growth and differentiation, maintenance of homeostasis, and finally reproduction. So hormones have a very crucial role to play in our body. So in terms of growth, the hormones that are usually involved in growth is, of course, your growth hormone, your IGF-1 or your insulin-like growth factor, your thyroid hormones, because they all stimulate growth. So if you lack any of those in your developmental stage, you will have some form of growth stunting. Sex steroids, such as your testosterone and estrogens, also have an impact in terms of growth and development, because your sex steroids lead to epiphyseal closure. So if you have deficiency in your sex steroids, instead of closing your epiphyseal bones, so you will have continuous growth. You can have continuous bone lengthening and development. So I will discuss that more when we go to male and female reproductive endocrinology. So people can have short stature if they have growth hormone deficiency, or even hypothyroidism in childhood, especially in the neonatal and infancy period. Even Cushing syndrome, excess cortisol, precocious puberty, malnutrition, chronic illnesses, or genetic abnormalities that affect epiphyseal growth plates. So all of this can result in short stature. So patients with, let's say, congenital hypothyroidism will experience not just growth stunting, but also delay in their mental development. In terms of the function of hormones, in terms of maintenance of homeostasis, the hormones involved in this is, number one, your thyroid hormone, which controls about 25% of basal metabolism in most tissues. You also have your cortisol that exerts a permissive action for many hormones in addition to its own direct effect. So when we go to your adrenal glands, we will talk more detail about the actions of cortisol in the body. Your parathyroid hormone regulates your calcium and phosphorus level. And of course, your calcium is involved in many processes in the body, even enzymatic processes and biochemical pathways. So that's why it's very crucial with homeostasis. Your vasopressin, or your antidiuretic hormone, regulates serum osmolality by controlling renal free water clearance. So when we go into our session on pituitary, I'll discuss about that. Your mineralocorticoids, as your aldosterone, control vascular volume and serum electrolyte. And lastly, of course, your insulin. So your insulin maintains normal glucose homeostasis in both the fed and fasted state. It's not listed here, but your glucagon is another hormone that is involved in glucose homeostasis as well. So these are just some of the examples. We talked earlier about hormonal rhythms, and environmental events all affect hormonal rhythms. So seasonal changes can affect levels of hormones. That's why in some countries, when it's winter time, some more people actually experience depression, and these are all because there is a hormonal contribution to this phenomenon during winter, during winter. And then light dark cycle can also affect your hormonal rhythms. So that's why let's say in the morning when you wake up, your cortisol will start to peak between 8 to 10 a.m. and then at nighttime, at midnight, there will be a reduction. There will be nadir, or a lowering of the levels of your cortisol hormone. Your meals also affect, hormonal level, particularly your insulin and your glucagon level. So, for example, you're in the fed state, you will have an increase in insulin secretion and a suppression in your glucagon hormones. But you're in the fasting state, you're sleeping, you're not eating, there will be a suppression of your insulin level and a rise in your glucagon level in order to maintain glucose levels in the body when you're not eating. Stress is another important factor that affects your hormonal levels, most particularly your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, no? But not only that, also other hormonal systems in the body is markedly affected by stress. So stress is not just all items. Stress can have a lot of physical manifestations that is usually mediated by your hormonal systems. Sleep also affects hormone secretion. So another example that I mentioned earlier is your growth hormone. So when kids go to sleep, their growth hormone increases, facilitating in development. That's why growth and development, they say, happens mostly during sleep time. So sleep also affects our hormonal levels. Hormonal rhythms. So an example would be your menstrual cycle. Have you ever wondered why the body can tell whether it's already 28 days time for you to have your menstruation? No? So the menstrual cycle is repeated on average every 28 days. It depends from person to person. Some women will have a 26-day cycle or a 30-day cycle, no? Reflecting the time required to follicular maturation and ovulation. So we'll discuss about the menstrual cycle in more detail when we go to your female reproductive endocrinology. So the menstrual cycle is not just your obstetrics, it's not just under obstetrics and gynecology, it's also under endocrinology because this is governed by your different hormones. And then lastly, I mentioned earlier about your circadian rhythms or the diurnal rhythm. So this is an example. So when you wake up in the morning, your cortisol levels will start to rise and will peak between 8 to 10 a.m. and then will start going down. And at nighttime, when the cortisol level will start to go down and will have its lowest level at around 12 midnight or the nadir level. If this is the peak, this is the nadir. And then in the early morning, it will rise upon the stimulation of your ACTH, and then the cycle goes on and on again. So to summarize, endocrinology is a scientific and medical discipline with a unique focus on hormones and its associated fields, and features a multidisciplinary approach to understanding hormones and their diseases. So hormones either act on receptors on the plasma membranes of target cells or move inside the cell to bind to cellular receptors or even intranuclear receptors. In either case, the cell is not a passive recipient of signals, but rather has key roles in regulating the responses to hormones. And control of hormone secretion, as we discussed earlier, involves multiple inputs from distant targets, from nervous system through your neuroendocrine system, local paracrine and autocrine factors, all leading to complex patterns of circadian secretion, pulsatile secretion driven by homeostatic stimuli or stimuli that lead to secular changes over the lifespan, whether you are a neonate, an infant, early childhood, puberty, adulthood, and even in the elderly population. Endocrine diseases fall into broad categories of hormone over or underproduction, altered tissue response to hormones such as your hormone resistance, or tumors arising from endocrine tissue. So we discussed that in depth I think that was in part 2. So hopefully you learned a lot from parts 1, 2, and 3 discussing approach to endocrine disorders. So thank you for listening and see you in class.